Vincent, I think this is a super book, the Jakarta Method. I think it's very important. It's a very important book. I've, of course, known about this massacre for very much the length of my life, because what you mentioned just now is something that was not just a chilling warning to the peoples of South America, but to all communist forces around the world and left forces. And in India as well, the suggestion that something like this might occur was not far away. In 1957, the first communist government, democratically elected in the state of Kerala, comes to power. And in 1959, it's forcibly removed. This occurs in 59, which is 5 years before what happens in Brazil, and 6 years before what happens in Jakarta, in Indonesia. This was also a CIA operation. And it was where the CIA very deftly utilized social divides in Kerala that should not be used for politics, divides between Christians and others and so on. The kind of attitude towards politics that you see in Brazil, where Christianity is mobilized against the communists, and the communists are called, haters of tradition and so on, just as you see in Brazil. And so I think that what you've written is a story of most of our countries, where the Central Intelligence Agency, in alliance with the worst kind of oligarchies, the most repulsive political forces, used force, used violence to shape the world in their image. And at the end of the day, you get Bolsonaro, you get Narendra Modi, you get repellent characters like this, because they are the direct product of this history. They are not accidental. People ask, how did we get here? We got here because you allowed and prosecuted the genocide or politicide against the left. And I think that's a very significant thing as far as I'm concerned. I decided to write Washington Bullets after at least 3 coups bothered me greatly in our recent time. The first coup, of course, most recently in Bolivia. And I was actually quite astounded to find sensitive, decent people offering justifications for the violent overthrow of the government of Evo Morales. And that to me was unbelievable. It was not easy to understand that sensible people with an understanding of the history of US imperialism would come out and say, but Morales did this, Morales did that. As if doing this or that was justification for the military coming and telling an elected leader, it's time for you to go, for the US embassy to have a role behind that, and for a minor political force to take power with the military's backing. It was astounding to see people behave as if this was a legitimate action. That was just in 2019. 10 years before that, there was a similar coup in Honduras against the government of Zelaya. Ridiculous operation, backed not by the right wing in the United States, but by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It was a coup against the people of Honduras. And see what happened right after. The left people fled for their lives. I mean, they were afraid of the Jakarta Method, in Honduras, not in 1973, not in 1978, but in 2009. And then you had Japan, where the people of Japan democratically elected a government led by Hatoyama with a mandate of removing the US base at Okinawa. That was the mandate of Hatoyama's government, to remove the base in Okinawa. Hillary Clinton arrives in Japan. Barack Obama's team tells the Japanese that we will not honor you at all and there'll be no state banquet. We're not interested. They punish the Japanese, put pressure on the Japanese political class, and Hatoyama is removed from office. Now, nobody called that a coup d'etat. They said, it's internal politics, Japan, it's so confusing. It's not confusing. The Japanese people elected a government with a mandate to remove a US base in Okinawa. And instead of allowing that democratic mandate to be put forward, the United States government meddled in Japanese politics and removed Hatoyama. I found it remarkable that in the United States, there's such innocent innocent feeling of meddling in the US election, Russia meddling, innocent. The United States for over 200 years has not meddled in other people's politics, has shaped them. What happened in Indonesia in 65, as Vincent argues very well in the book, that was not meddling in Indonesian politics. By bringing military officers to train in Kansas and god-awful places where they were trained in counterinsurgency, what is called counterinsurgency. But it's really, they were trained in dictatorship. And they're trained in dictatorship in these military bases in the US. That's not meddling in Indonesian politics. That's shaping the political culture of Indonesia, which lasts basically till today. So, this innocent thing, oh my God, they did this. So what I wanted to do, given that these coups happen now, Japan, Honduras, Haiti before that, the removal of Aristide, twice removed from office. This is now. This is not in the 50s and 60s. But I decided that the heart of my book, which is a manual of regime change, should go back to Guatemala. Because in my opinion, and by the way, Renata Avila, this is for you. In my opinion, Guatemala sets the manual for what comes for decades. It sets the manual. It's a cliche, what they do. And I lay out 9 points of that in Guatemala, from basically delegitimizing the government to assassination of key people. And in the middle of that, you have the typical things, building up strength with the most bilious sections of the military, encouraging popular unrest. Again, by, in this case, not the CIA operating alone, but by what, at least in the case of British Guyana, was quite chillingly called, not the AFL-CIO, that's the American Trade Union Federation, but what they called it, the AFL-CIA, because the AFL-CIO operated with the CIA to build up right-wing unions and do strikes to paralyze the government. This is a cliche. Everything you see in Guatemala in 1953, when Che Guevara was sitting there and thinking, man, we have to do this revolution business a different way. We can't allow ourselves to be outflanked like in the way, Arbenz was outflanked. And Che is sitting right there and watching this and saying, what is going on? What happens in Guatemala in 54 is essentially what continues to the present day. It's a cliche. And that's what I want to bring up. And I want to tell our friends who look at Bolivia in 2019 and say, well, Morales deserved it. I want them to recognize that in American coups from the 50s onward, people like them have always, when confronted with the coup, justified it. People like them have always justified it. And I don't mean liberals, I mean people of the so-called metropolitan left have always tended to justify the coup at that time. Only later, when the evidence finally trickles out, they say, as if they'd always said it, that the coup was a bad thing. But that's always with hindsight, a huge amount of hindsight. So the reason Vincent's book is so important, the reason I wrote my book, was to tell people it's no longer acceptable for you in the middle of a coup to essentially provide soft ideological cover for it. And then later, 20 years later, rehabilitate your reputation by saying we always thought it was a bad idea. Sorry, that's not allowed anymore. When the United States now, and this is the last thing I'll say, Jordan, when the United States now goes after the government of Venezuela, I think it's incumbent upon people to understand that what the US is doing to Venezuela is exactly what the US did to Chile in 73. Actually, not 73, sorry. What they did to Chile from 1970 to 1973. That was a prolonged suffocation of that country. Yesterday when I was following what's happening in Minneapolis, I saw a picture of a Malcolm X quote, which I very much like. Malcolm X says, we don't have a chip on our shoulder. We have your foot on our neck. That doesn't just apply to people who are, suffocated by the police in Minneapolis. That applies to countries. Venezuela currently doesn't have a chip on its shoulder. It has the Yankee boot on its neck. And at this point in the middle of history, if you're unable to look at the structure of imperialism, if you're unable to make a moral choice now, basically, I feel you lost the plot. And we will not allow you to rehabilitate yourself 25 years from now, when you finally see the terrible things Pompeo is writing in secret, when those are leaked or revealed after a certain period. The Cold War, I don't think ever really began, and it didn't end. It's an ideological category. I mean, it's not useful to understand history, frankly. People who are scholars of the Cold War constantly try to periodize the hotter versions, the colder versions. I find they're missing the point here. They have accepted a narrative that the Cold War was a fight between the free world and the authoritarian world. This is Hannah Arendt's nonsense from 1951. A book, by the way, Origins of Totalitarianism, which does the CIA's work for it, because it essentially recasts communism as another form of fascism. And it's a very disturbing book because it gets promoted and so on. But we can talk about that later. There is a much more fundamental issue at work, and that goes back to the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is the first real, successful attempt of the world's people to fight off the forces of imperialism. In the wake of the French Revolution, the people of Haiti rise up. They demand for themselves universal humanhood. They are denied that. The French try to squash them. And there's a direct line that goes from the French trying to squash the Haitians all the way to the French trying to take back Indochina in 1945, after Ho Chi Minh declares the independence of Indochina as Vietnam, and the Dutch returning to Indonesia in the late 1940s to reclaim it. I mean, it's a straight line. These forces of imperialism and colonialism simply will not acknowledge decolonization. In 1961, as a consequence of the decolonization movement in the United Nations, they put a beautiful, it's actually my favorite UN General Assembly resolution, and I quote it all the time because I very much like it. They say that liberation is irresistible. You cannot resist the forces of liberation and freedom. It's not resistible. We will continue to fight. This is the work of Fanon. We are creating humanity in our struggle. So that's the principal contradiction. It runs all the way from then, when the Haitian people said, look, we are going to determine our own destiny. We are going to grow things. We are going to live. We are not producing sugarcane for you. We are going to live for ourselves. That runs all the way to Bolivia last year, when the resource socialism of Evo Morales said, we have lithium. Okay, in an ideal world, we wouldn't take it out of the ground. We don't want to ruin the earth and so on. But we are also stuck. I mean, people are starving. There's illiteracy. There's lack of electrification. We want to improve the livelihood of people. If we take out the lithium from the ground, it's on our terms. We are going to control it. There is nothing that differentiates for me the struggle of the Haitian Revolution to the project of the Bolivian government under Evo Morales Ayma. It's a direct line. And against that is arrayed the very same forces. The French government in the 1791 is identical to the United States and its set kind of group of oligarchies in 2019. It's a direct link between the two. There is no difference. So for people to say something changes in 45, it changes in 89, okay, that's fine. But to my mind, it's specious, because behind all that is a much longer trajectory of struggle, which is the demand of peoples who are treated as lesser. And that's important. This is not merely the struggle for human freedom. I do not accept that. It's not merely the struggle for human freedom, because somehow accidentally it turns out that all these people who are most fundamentally denied their rights are not white. And so therefore we have to understand in a very cross-cutting way that the question of race is on the table. We have to understand that it's not incidental, that it's Haiti that is penalized and has to therefore pay reparations to France right into the 20th century. Haiti paid for liberating, people who had been enslaved. And Bolivians are going to pay. I mean, especially indigenous Bolivians. Inside Bolivia, this was a coup of the settlers against the indigenous. Let's not forget it. Morales is trying to create a plurinational Bolivia. These people essentially want to create a settler colonial Christian Bolivia. That is not liberation. That is going to be overthrown in time. I mean, I'm a fundamental believer that the future is ours. I don't think everything is going to be gloomy. Human beings do not tolerate oppression. And therefore, when that UN resolution comes that, it's irresistible, I truly believe that. Let's just look at Cuba. It's a great example. People will wonder, why was there a coup in Chile? Why couldn't the Americans overthrow the government in Cuba? I mean, that I think is the question on the table. If you're a serious historian of this period, you have to ask the question, why were they not able to overthrow a country's government just 90 miles, from Florida? What is the issue here? Well, there's incredible scholarship on Cuba, and I think it's quite clear what happens if you look at even Bay of Pigs. Firstly, it's difficult to overthrow a government if the government comes to the people and says, genuinely, we are with you. If the government does what the Cuban government did in the first few years, where they expropriated big capital, and they said, we just simply don't want a society in which people are exploiting others at this rate and accumulating profits and taking it to the United States. We just don't want that. You don't see that taking place in other places. It is actually instructive that Che Guevara was in Guatemala in 1954 and watched the overthrow, because what Arbenz was trying to do is to tell United Fruit, by the way, United Fruit is a company whose shareholders were also people who were the head of the CIA and so on. They were materially invested in protecting United Fruit's control over Guatemala. But Arbenz basically was trying to bring the resources to the people, use it to better the lives of the people. He was overthrown. So what they do in Cuba is they arm the people. They arm them not only with guns, they arm the people with ideology. From 59 to 61, Castro has already taught the people in those incredible speeches. He was basically the professor of Cuba. You may not understand, if you've never seen Castro speak in Havana, you do not understand that Castro didn't give 3-hour speeches to crowds who were bored. He gave 3-hour speeches to crowds who were scintillated, because he was the voice of Cuba. He was explaining things. It was a political report. And it was very interesting. They armed the people with ideology, with a commitment to the Cuban Revolution, and they armed them. It was the committees in defense of the revolution that fought off the ridiculous invading force at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. That's how they did it. They said to the people, we are genuinely and immediately going to cease allowing exploitation to take place. We'll try to create society on a different foundation, on volunteerism and so on. That example should be with us today. Governments have to have the courage, basically, to stand up against this pressure from global capitalism and say, no, we will not allow ourselves. I just want to give you a statistic, Jordan, that I think amplifies this. Last year, 120 countries out of 193 spent more money paying off their servicing to debt, debts that they had taken from commercial lenders, from governments, multilateral lenders. 120 countries in the world out of 193 spent more on paying the interest on their debt than they paid for healthcare. And then you are surprised when countries are unprepared for the coronavirus. I mean, it is an absolute criminal situation that countries are essentially forced to pay their precious surplus to service debts among people who don't need those debts. So there should be immediate debt cancellation. That is actually the way forward. Unless you immediately cancel debt, you cannot create humanity in the world. And I'm very sorry to say that it's not just the ridiculousness of the Trump administration or whatever that's the problem here. You see this in the so-called Frugal Four in Europe. And these are all so-called liberal countries, Sweden and so on. They don't even want to allow Italy, which is struggling to survive now, to mutualize the debt. Forget the developing world. So there's no conversation, Jordan, that can begin unless you take debt off the table. Every single IMF coup that took place, from the 1960s onward, and that's a different kind of coup. It's not a coup, like what you see in Jakarta, but it's a coup nonetheless. It's a IMF coup. Every single coup that you see over the last 50 years is around the question of debt and debt servicing. And so we need to have a robust discussion to simply say we are for the cancellation of debt, not suspension, not haircut. We want a cancellation. It is an absolute crime that the British government, until recently, was paying the descendants of slave owners for the expropriation of their property in Jamaica. But the British government never paid reparations to Jamaica. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. About oil, and how, Vincent, people always say, well, come on, they roll their eyes. It's not just oil, it's democracy, right? It's not oil, it's democracy. It's not lithium in Bolivia, it's not indium, it's democracy. We heard that just a few months ago. It's democracy. If it was actually democracy in Bolivia, why was Morales removed in November of 2019? Because he got elected the third time, and his mandate for the third election was to run till early 2020. When he won the election again in 2019, that election mandate should have begun in 2020, January or February. So he was removed in November 2019. The Liberals should at the very least have said, let him finish his term till January or February. No, they didn't. They allowed the removal in November. So even procedurally, you see, I'm coming to the point when people say, well, it's about democracy, not resources. If it's actually about democracy, then why don't you honor your own procedural principles? They don't. It's not about proceduralism. It's not about democracy. This is a fraud. If you take the case of how Lula faced lawfare and was not able to run in the election when it was clear to everybody he was going to wipe the floor. Bolsonaro is a buffoon. He should never have been elected. I think even the elites in Brazil were a little bit, stunned that this buffoonish character, this thug, became the president of their very great Brazil. Lula's removal was not on procedural grounds either. And then we learned that the shenanigans of Moro and the Americans and the money that was transferred and the fact that there was no evidence against Lula and there was no apartment really here that he had taken possession of, that the whole thing was a joke. But it wasn't a joke because liberals, in the name of proceduralism, easily violate procedure if it protects their interests. Then we must ask the question, what are the interests? And I think that's significant. In a place like Bolivia, it does come down to the fact that it has an enormous holding of lithium. And unlike Chile, where the lithium is much harder to get out of the ground, in Bolivia, it's easier. What happened in Libya? Come on. In Libya in 2011, the overthrow of Gaddafi, I don't want anybody to tell me that was about bringing democracy to Libya. First went to Libya in the 1970s. I can tell you that there's never been an interest in the West to bring democracy there. There's merely an interest to take hold of that oil. It's the best oil in the world. It's right across the waters from Italy. The Europeans, they want the oil, they don't want the people. We've seen that in our own lifetime. We've seen how Europe has behaved towards human beings trying to cross in boats into Europe. They don't want people to come, but they want the oil to come. And that, I think, just to underscore what Vincent said earlier, the fact that they'd rather have the oil than people tells you something about the nature of imperialism. I think we have to understand that the Jakarta Method was used in the United States as well, and before it happened in Indonesia. When the Russian Revolution or the revolution against the Tsar's empire takes place in 1917, you have an attack on the American left that is as severe as anything. The Palmer raids, the 1919 attack on the left, all the way. It doesn't just start with McCarthyism. I think it's a very interesting thing that we know the McCarthyite period after World War II, but the anti-left goes back. In fact, it predates the Russian Revolution. Back into the 19th century. Trade unionists were, I would highly recommend people go and watch Matewan, a terrific film by John Sayles, about how it was so hard to be an organizer. You listen to the poetry of Martin Espada when he writes about, the factory struggles in New Jersey and where a young John Reed is just astounded by the violence of the Pinkertons and the private security forces against labor, authorized violence against the working class. Go back and look at how any type of organizing, whether by Native Americans or by Latinos or African Americans, ruthlessly put down. The amount of state violence inside the United States is incredible. How the trade union movement is bought in with business unionism. And what happens when when an imperialist country destroys opposition inside the country is that then whatever you do abroad, you don't pay a price at home. Because at home, people will not rise up against you. You don't pay a price. You can do anything abroad. At home, you will be able to tell people we're just doing it for democracy. We're doing it, that phrase, violence is as American as apple pie. We're doing it for apple pie. We're doing it so that you live well. I mean, this must be seen. I don't want people to believe that what happens abroad, like in Indonesia, didn't happen in the United States. I mean, the Communist Party was destroyed in the United States deliberately. Okay, they may not have gone and killed 1 million people, but they destroyed people's lives. I remember talking to a child of a communist leader in Connecticut who said that when the FBI came and arrested his father, they turned to him and his sister and said, we'll make sure you never go to college. Things that were aspirational in America. They threatened these little kids. This is the FBI in the United States. So yes, I mean, the stories you'll read in Indonesia where people were wiped out, or in Argentina where they were taken on helicopters or planes and thrown into the ocean. You don't see that in large numbers in the United States, that kind of killing. Okay, you don't. I mean, yes, you see Medgar Evers shot and you see people killed. It's not that killing doesn't happen. We know Malcolm X was killed. We know Martin Luther King was killed. We know assassinations happen in the United States. Yes, they happen to trade unionists whose names we don't know. But there's also intimidation. There's, it's terribly hard to be a leftist in the US. I have great compassion for people who continue the struggle because the free price that the US government gets to operate overseas, they must not get that free check anymore. If they're going to try to obliterate Venezuela, there need to be mass demonstrations in this country saying, we will not allow you to do it without paying the price at home. But they don't pay the price at home, which is why Joe Biden can put out that racist advertisement about China, which is why Biden can make the comment saying that I'm going to continue sanctions on Cuba, which is why Biden says I'm going to support, who? Who is he going to support? Juan Guaido of Venezuela. It's a joke, man. I mean, it's a joke. The world will laugh at you, but what do you care about the world laughing at you? Because the world is also scared of you. As they say, it's better to have fear than to have admiration. And the United States of America is certainly more feared than admired, despite what Americans sometimes believe about themselves. There's no doubt. I mean, I'm going to just say this as my last words, Jordan, if that's okay. Firstly, I really want to say, please read Vincent's book, The Jakarta Method. It's very good, very important book. It's important because we should never forget people who have, given their lives for a beautiful idea. And, as they said in France in 1968, they said, under the paving stones is the beach. Actually, in Washington Bullets, I take that line and I say, under the paving stones are our martyrs who have been killed for that beautiful idea. And I really, as you read Vince's book, one part of reading these kind of books is not only to arm ourselves for the present and for struggles in the future, but it's also to remember that we don't always stand on the shoulders of people who have made history. We also walk on the graves of those who've sacrificed themselves for a different kind of history, which we were not able to live in. And, it's a real terror for people in places like Indonesia, who suffered after 1965, the lack of a beautiful history. And I really, one of the reasons I'm very grateful that you have done this book and that Oppenheimer made that film. The reason I'm really grateful for all that is it's brought worldwide attention to the history that could have been and was not allowed. For that reason, I think that people need to have discussions about the immensity of the sacrifice of people in the past and what this demands of us now. It doesn't demand half measures. I think that's a big error in our time. We live in a politics of half measures. You're supposed to compromise here, compromise there. You should stand for something. As they say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I think that's an issue. People need to stand for something. And, I very much recommend stand for the beautiful idea.